This video offers some ideas of ways that you can have healthy New Year's treats that are still flavorable and enjoyable. This has been a challenging year, and a lot of us have probably slipped with regard to our eating habits because it's been really challenging in general. So if you're trying to find some things that you want to eat for New Year's that are healthier, this is the video to watch. We're going to assume from the start that if you're viewing this video, you're looking for healthy options, so that will be the focus here. I do promise you that all of these recipes are really tasty, but in a variety of ways, they are healthier than a lot of the foods that we tend to eat on New Year's. Foods can still be tasty, but also be healthy. So what we're going to suggest are some things that you can do to keep the flavors that you like while increasing fiber, which is supposed to be good for the heart, and also decreasing saturated and processed fats, which can also be bad for the heart, as well as decreasing salt, also a heart issue, and then also decreasing additives and preservatives in foods and retaining more nutrients. One thing that we're learning about a lot of the processed foods, like the chips and different packaged things that we get in the stores, is that if you read the labels, you'll find that there are more additives and preservatives that are not necessarily so great for us. And we're also finding that even if it's considered organic, if it's heavily processed, it's losing its nutrients. So the more you can find things that you can put together yourself at home, quick, easy things that bring together basic ingredients like vegetables, seeds, nuts, and whole grains, the more you're going to retain the nutrients of those foods, and you'll benefit from them more while you enjoy them. So this video will break things down into two main groups: savory treats and then sweet treats. We'll focus a bit more on savory treats because, especially if you're planning on something for New Year's Eve, you might be looking at more savory kinds of things that you'd like to have. So we'll have a few savory recipes, and then we'll shift into a couple of suggestions for sweet treats as well that you can make yourself that are healthy and tasty. One thing you can do that may not sound very appealing is to make chips from kale. I promise you that these are really tasty, especially if you have a nice seasoning on them. And if you follow these instructions, you're going to get nice crispy kale that has a nice crunch, a satisfying crunch to it. No, it doesn't taste the same as potato chips. And you can, of course, make your own potato chips, making them at home with olive oil instead of with the processed and especially hydrogenated oils that you might find in the packaged chips is already going to be healthier. So if you'd like to do that, go for it. We're not offering a potato chip recipe here, but you can certainly find those around. This recipe is for the kale. And when we made them last week for Christmas, I used my favorite mesquite barbecue seasoning. It's actually a rub that is probably mostly intended for meats and maybe occasionally for vegetables, but I used it to get onto the kale. We're not going to make these here today. It's a fairly easy, straightforward recipe. There's another recipe I will show you later, but I would just say that if you're going to make this recipe, what you want to make sure that you do is get the olive oil spread evenly on the kale chips. That way they will hold on to the seasoning more, and it will be more balanced and evenly spread. So you just need your kale and a tablespoon of spice blend, anything that you are interested in using. I do recommend reading the labels because some of them are going to have additives or preservatives and maybe have some salt added to it. So if you're watching for salt, you might try to pick something that doesn't have salt added, or if it does have salt added, maybe refrain from adding salt until you at least taste the chips with the seasoning by themselves and see if you need anything else. The seasoning that I have had a little bit of salt added to it, The mesquite barbecue had just a little bit of salt added and a little bit of sugar. So there was a little bit in it that maybe is not ideal. But you can also find things like curry powders and chili powders that don't have any of those things added, and those would even be healthier. But you just take the kale, and once you've washed it thoroughly, break it into pieces that are about the size of the chips that you'd want to just pick up and eat like a potato chip, and then put it in a bowl and add the olive oil. And then I used my hands. You can start by stirring it with a spoon, but I used my hands to work the oil onto the kale leaves. And once the oil was spread around evenly on the kale leaves, I added the seasoning and stirred again. And I actually got my hands back down in there and made sure that things got mixed properly, because it's a large bunch of leaves. So it can be hard to make sure that everything gets mixed properly without getting your hands down in there. And then just spread it out on a sheet of paper, a baking sheet, maybe with parchment paper, but you don't have to use parchment paper, and just bake it at 350 for about 5 minutes. Turn it over and then bake it for another 5, and then start watching it. It took about 11 minutes for me to make these and get them nice and crispy. And this is what they look like ready to go into the oven. And then the picture on the bottom shows you what they look like when they come out. They're browned, which makes them nice and crispy. So they have a nice crunch to them. And honestly, they are as addictive as barbecue potato chips for me with this barbecue seasoning that I used. So if you can find a nice seasoning that you like, or if you are planning to make a dip of some kind, make sure you use nice big pieces of kale if you're going to do something like that, because you'll want to have something that will pick up the dip, because they can get somewhat fragile, especially if they're in smaller pieces. But otherwise, this is a nice healthy treat to just eat by itself or to have with a dip of some kind. You can make them ahead as well, and they can store in an airtight container. They will stay crispy. We've been eating them for a few days now, and they've stayed crispy in an airtight container. Another thing that you can make ahead is your own seasoned nut mix. If you like to eat nuts, you can of course buy nuts in the grocery store. And the main reason I would recommend making it yourself, other than if you like doing these kinds of things in the kitchen, like I do, is that sometimes when you get them in the store, they can again have more salt than you might want, and the cheaper brands are going to have hydrogenated oils and oils that are potentially chemically pressed, which you may be trying to avoid. So you can choose your oil, choose a non-GMO oil like I do. If you want to try to stay healthy, you can adjust your own salt as well, and you can adjust your sweeteners too, and not have high fructose corn syrup, for example, in a slightly sweetened nut mix. But here's a basic recipe. You can mix in any kinds of nuts or seeds that you'd like. Just make sure they're raw. And you can often get these in the bulk section of the grocery store. That's where I get them. And just stir them in a bowl with some olive oil. For every 2 cups of seeds and nuts, you want a teaspoon of olive oil, and then a 1/4 teaspoon of spice blend, or you can follow this recipe and do some cinnamon or ginger. And then if you want just a little bit of a kick to it, add 1/8 of a teaspoon of cayenne and just a little salt and pepper and a little maple syrup. I would recommend starting with 2 teaspoons if you want it to be sweet, and add a little more and taste it and see if it needs more. But much more than that, it's going to get pretty sweet. And you just bake these at 325 on an ungreased sheet, and let it cool after you bake it for 10 minutes, and they'll store in an airtight container. Just make sure they're completely cooled so that there's no moisture getting trapped that can make the spice blend get kind of maybe weird inconsistency. So you can play around with this. I made 2 different kinds of spiced nut blends. Actually, I used this recipe for one to make something slightly sweet, but I also used a sriracha spice mix for another one to have something that's more savory with a kick to it, because we like that kind of thing here in our house. Something that you want to probably make when you're ready to eat is seasoned glazed fries, and I recommend doing this with sweet potatoes. It works out really well, and sweet potatoes are healthy too. But you can also do it with regular potatoes if you'd prefer, if you don't like sweet potatoes. But for this recipe, you basically need about 2 pounds of potatoes, and then you need a couple of tablespoons of oil. This is pretty easy too. You basically combine everything and put it in a bowl and just stir everything so that it coats evenly. One thing I will say about this recipe, I'm not going to make this recipe here either because it's fairly straightforward, but I will say that it calls for tamarind paste. So if you have tamarind paste, or if you're familiar with it, or if you can get it easily and would like to try it, then use some tamarind paste. But if you can't find that, then you could use something like lemon juice or lime juice and maple syrup, because tamarind is a bit tangy, but it's also a bit sweet. Tamarind is basically a fruit. Well, tamarind is a tree, and they take the fruit from it and they use it to make all kinds of things. Different cultures make drinks from it, different kinds of foods. They'll eat the fruit itself, but you can make your own tamarind paste, or you can buy some in the store. You can make your own substitution for tamarind paste, or you can buy tamarind in the store or online. What I will say is be careful about what you buy if you're watching ingredients, because some of them will have additives in them, like many of the other things that you find in the grocery store. So it could be challenging to find it around here, especially to find a natural one like this. I had to buy this one online, but this is an organic tamarind paste, and it's basically just tamarind and a little bit of water. So you could do that, or you can just substitute if it's easier for you. A lemon juice or a lime juice is going to give it the tangy flavor, and then something like maple syrup or another liquid sweetener, or even a granular sweetener would be fine if you mix it together to make sure everything stirs in, because this will bake, so the sugar or other sweetened crystals will dissolve. So just stir all of those things together and then put that on a greased baking sheet, or you could use parchment paper if you prefer, and bake them for about 25 to 45 minutes. It depends on how big your potato pieces are. If you like to make thick wedges, it's going to take probably more like 45 minutes, but it might only be 25. The ones I made that you can see in this picture were a little bit thinner. And so these only took about 25 to 30 minutes for the potatoes to get tender. And you can see the tamarind makes it kind of dark. If you use something like maple syrup or agave or molasses, that would also make it kind of dark, but it doesn't necessarily have to be dark. It's not about that color as much as it is about the flavor. The tanginess of the tamarind and the sweetness of it mixes well with a spice blend like the one that's here. You could also just play around and do other things with it and use the paste or the juice mixture with some other seasoning than the cumin seeds. If you're not into cumin, you could do a little bit of chili powder, for example, or curry powder, anything that's got some spice to it that will be complemented by the sweet and tangy flavor of the tamarind or the lemon or lime. So the dish that I am going to make here today is buffalo cauliflower. We love buffalo dishes, and in our family in the past, we've had buffalo chicken dip with cream cheese and all of those kinds of things on New Year's Eve. I have moved away personally from eating meat in recent years because of health choices and other things in my own personal diet. But even if you like to continue to eat the meat, that's fine. I'm not here to push vegetarianism or veganism on you. I'm just here to suggest some things that might be healthier. Another option is that you could make your buffalo dip with chicken and things and have some of these other things on the side, like the kale chips that are maybe healthier than buying just the bags of potato chips at the grocery store. Find what works for you. But if you're looking for something healthier than a buffalo chicken recipe, this buffalo cauliflower recipe is super healthy because it's just basically got cauliflower, hot sauce, garlic powder, salt, and olive oil. Today I am going to use the buffalo hot wing sauce from Torchbearer, which is based in Mechanicsburg. So I'm using a local brand, but you can use whatever hot sauce you like that suits your palate, that your family enjoys, because different hot sauces have different heat. So find something that works for you and just mix those ingredients together in a bowl for the cauliflower. This is what my mixture looks like with the Torchbearer buffalo hot sauce. Yours might be a little bit thinner depending on the thickness of your hot sauce. It doesn't need to necessarily be thick, although you could add just a little bit of cornstarch or a little bit of flour if you wanted to thicken it a bit. It's not necessary though. This is just the thickness of my particular sauce. You'll want to wash and chop your cauliflower to whatever size you're interested in. You can cut it to a size that's good for picking up if you want this to be a kind of finger food. I'm planning to eat this probably with a fork rather than with my fingers. So I have some pieces that are bigger, but I also have some that are smaller and some that even just naturally broke off like that I don't want to waste. So cut the cauliflower to the size that works for you. And then depending on how big your cauliflower is, how big your pieces are, it will take more or less time for the cauliflower to bake in the oven. You could actually bread this cauliflower if you wanted to first and bake it with a plain breading to start, and then take it out once the breading has kind of set on the cauliflower, and then add this hot sauce mixture. But I decided to just skip the breading because I'm trying to just cut those little things out. It would potentially give it a little bit more crunch if you did that, which can be satisfying, but cauliflower itself, if you leave it just a little bit crispy, already has some crunch to it. And if you made the kale chips, those have some crunch. So I am skipping a breading today because it's just calories that I don't need, and I'm still going to have all the flavor. The only thing that's going to be missing from that combination of taste, the taste combination of flavor and aroma and all of those things will be some of the crunch that you can get with a breading, but I'm fine without that. So that's what I'm doing here today. I've stirred this and mixed it with the hot sauce mixture until the cauliflower is as coated as it's going to get. There might be a little bit underneath here that I can add to. I could even just pour a little bit more hot sauce in if I wanted to. But there's also some that I'm going to salvage from the bowl itself that I will get a spatula and get onto the cauliflower. But right now it's ready to go onto the baking sheet. So here's the cauliflower on the baking sheet, and I got a spatula and scraped every last bit of that hot sauce from the bowl and spread it on the pieces of cauliflower, especially underneath. So you can see there's a lot more sauce now in those spots that didn't originally get it from stirring. So the cauliflower is in the oven now, and I've set my timer for 15 minutes, and I will turn it and I'll set it for another 10 or 15 minutes and check it at that point. I'll probably check it after 25 minutes of baking total to see if it's firm enough and go from there. So that's the buffalo cauliflower, and I can show you what it looks like when it's done baking, but it's going to need to bake for a bit here. One thing you want to think about too is if you want to serve this cauliflower with anything, And if you're trying to stay healthy, you could potentially find a healthy ranch dipping sauce, a healthy ranch dressing, and use that. If you're having trouble finding something that suits, you could follow this recipe and make your own. Greek yogurt tends to be healthier than sour cream. You could also use a vegan sour cream, though watch the labels on those too, because there can be a lot of salt and things like that in the vegan options too. That's why I recommend making things for yourself if you're trying to be super healthy. But this is a fairly quick and easy recipe if you've got all of the ingredients, so you could use this to make a healthy ranch dipping sauce. I'm not going to serve this with anything other than to just eat it. I might have just a little bit of sour cream or a little Greek yogurt with it, but I'm not going to worry about making a sauce to go with it because I like the buffalo flavor. So that's the savory dishes we're offering today. Some other things to think about. There are 2 other videos on our library website from earlier this year that you might check out if you haven't already for other potential ideas. There are a number of things you could do from the healthy dips and condiments video, and you can serve some of those with raw veggies or with the kale chips if you want to make those instead of a processed chip or cracker. You can also take a look at the plant-based burger video and make them smaller as sliders. If you want to be super healthy and not just have plant-based burgers, but also avoid the rolls, you could use lettuce or some other leafy green instead of bread as a wrap, or you could get a nice whole grain roll of some kind that at least has some fiber in it, especially if you're able to get something that's local, organic, those kinds of things that don't have a lot of additives and preservatives in them. Sometimes the breads can have that stuff too if you're trying to avoid it. Sweet treats, we have a couple of recipes to share here today that you might want to think about. And there aren't as many sweet recipes that we're offering because it's harder to make something healthy that's sweet without just saying eat some fruit. That's always an option. You can always do something like Greek yogurt with some fresh fruit or some frozen fruit, something that you like. That would be a very healthy way to do something somewhat sweet. But if you want to actually make something that is actually sweet, but that isn't terribly bad for you, here are a couple of recipes you can think about. Tofu pudding is one that you can do. You can use firm or silken tofu, but you'll need a package of it. Just know that if you choose a firm tofu, you're going to end up with a thicker pudding at the end. Silken tofu is going to make a softer pudding than the firm will. So the texture will be a little bit different depending on what your preference is or what you're able to find. Just know that that's going to produce a different texture and consistency. And then you'll need some maple syrup or another kind of sweetener, some salt if you want to add it, but not much, and then some milk to help to make it more of a liquid. You can use a low-fat milk, or you can use a plant-based milk if you'd like to try to stay healthier on this. But the tofu also is healthier than just a regular dairy pudding because tofu itself is already going to provide you some fiber, some protein, some nutrients. So just choosing the tofu is a different kind of option. And you can even get non-GMO tofu to avoid the beans that might have been produced in a conventional way if you're trying to avoid that kind of farming. You just need a little flour to thicken it up, or some cornstarch and a little vanilla. And then you can add some spices too if you want. Just know that once you have whisked together the tofu, the maple syrup, and the milk, and then pureed it in a blender, you want to cook it for a little bit and then whisk in flour and the rest of the milk. And after it's cooked enough, you can add the vanilla and any cinnamon or spice you might want to use. I added some cinnamon to mine and it tasted really nice, but you could use a pie spice or ginger or whatever you like. That would be something that you might do with a sweet kind of baked. If you want to do something that's more like a traditional Asian tofu pudding, they often use cardamom. So that's another way to go if you like cardamom and have some around. And then you can serve this with some fruit if you'd like, or you can eat it plain. It's really tasty by itself. If you can see here, I made some tofu pudding and I used a firm tofu because I buy a local tofu that's made in Pennsylvania that is organic. So that's really the only option I had since I wanted to get that particular kind of tofu. So I got a fairly thick pudding out of it. So you can see when I processed it in the blender, how thick it was to start, but it was fairly evenly pureed. And then I cooked it just very briefly, especially since I used the firm tofu. I didn't want it to thicken too much. And you want to try to whisk it as much as possible when you're adding in the flour. And you'll get a nice pudding at the end that will look like that picture at the top. That's the firm tofu making a very thick pudding, which is going to hold some fruit on top really nicely if you want to eat it that way. And the other recipe is a really quick, easy thing that I put together a couple of years ago when I was craving chocolate and peanut butter, but didn't want to do anything super junky like peanut butter cups or something else that I might buy in the store or even make for myself in the form of baked goods. So I just mixed together some Greek yogurt, some cocoa, some maple syrup, and some peanut butter. But you don't need to have the peanut butter. You could use a different kind of nut butter if you prefer, or you can just skip it completely if you're allergic to nuts or would prefer to just have a plain chocolate kind of yogurt. Both ways, it's really tasty and it's really pretty rich and satisfying. So you just take your yogurt and mix it together with the cocoa and your sweetener. I recommend that you start with this amount of sweetener, and then once everything is mixed thoroughly, whisk it until the cocoa and everything is mixed well, and then taste it and see if you need anything. You might want a little more chocolate, or you might want a little more sweetener. It depends on how rich you'd like it to be. And you might want to add a little more peanut butter or other nut butter if you want more of that, if you're doing it that way. But this will keep in the fridge for as long as the yogurt would keep. So if you have a very short dated yogurt, obviously you'd need to eat it soon. If it's a longer date, obviously if you've opened it, it's not going to last as long as it would have if it had been in the sealed packaging. But it'll keep for however long the yogurt will keep, and it's a really nice treat. I even made the chocolate one as a pie for our holiday celebration this year, partly because I just had some extra pie crust left over and I knew I wasn't going to make any more pies for a while. So I just rolled it into a very small pie plate and I mixed up enough of this yogurt with the chocolate flavor, the cocoa and the maple syrup to fill that small pie. And it made a really nice, rich, fairly decadent tasting dessert. But really the worst part of it was the pie crust itself. So if you eat it without that, you're even eating something that's fairly healthy for you. Those are some suggestions. You can do some other things as well. Find your own recipes from cookbooks and online for things that you like, flavors that you like. If you want crunchy foods, if you want snack foods, things to sit down with for a holiday meal, whatever it is you're looking for. But know that some of the things we've talked about are what you want to watch out for. When you make things yourself, you're reducing those additives and preservatives, you're reducing the hydrogenated ingredients, you're reducing the salt, or you can at least control the salt. There's less processing if you are eating whole foods, then you're getting more of the nutrients than if you have something that's been completely processed in a factory. And those healthier oils too are better for you. Olive oil, sunflower oil, you can use those instead of butter. You can use low-fat Greek yogurt and plant-based yogurts instead of a dairy that has a lot more fat in it. And you can use low-fat milks and plant-based milks to avoid the extra fats as well that you're going to find in especially cow's dairy. The cauliflower is going to be done soon, and I'm just letting it get a little bit tender. One thing I could say about the cauliflower that I didn't before is that if you'd like it to be crispier, you can always turn up the heat in the oven to 400 or 425. If you'd like your cauliflower to get burnt on the edges, then definitely turn up the heat in your oven. You can even just turn it up at the end if you want, and just for maybe the last 10 minutes, have the heat up to 425 or 450, and that could help to make it crispy. I don't necessarily want my cauliflower to be crispy. I'm planning to basically eat it as I would cauliflower in general. So I like it to be somewhat tender, but not necessarily crispy, because I'll keep using it anyway, and I might even freeze some. And so the crispiness is lost once I freeze it. So I'm not so worried about that for myself. But if you'd like to enjoy it fresh from the oven, in a crispy, crunchy way, then just turn up the heat in the oven and just watch it. Keep a close watch on it to make sure it doesn't burn. So this is what my cauliflower looks like now. It's not crispy, but it's tender and cooked to my preference. Took about 25 minutes for it to cook at 375 with some slightly larger pieces and some smaller pieces. So those are the recipes I'm recommending for New Year's. There are plenty others out there. You can look around with some of the ideas in mind that I've recommended here for finding some healthy things to eat. I hope that you have a healthy and happy New Year, and I look forward to more videos in January.